Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are remembered as one of the most disturbing serial killer couples in British history. But their crimes were not simply the result of two violent people meeting. They were the product of obsession, ideology, control, and a relationship that turned fantasy into reality. To understand how this happened, we need to first look at the psychology of the individuals and then what emerged when their minds collided. Welcome to Something with Rum. I'm Charlene, where we explore the darker side to the human mind. Ian Brady was born the 2nd of January 1938 in Glasgow, Scotland. He spent much of his early life moving between caregivers and foster homes. Now, this early instability is significant, not because it excuses later behaviour, but because this instability can disrupt emotional development, specifically that of empathy, emotional attachment, and moral boundaries. Brady grew up without consistent emotional bonds, which is often associated with emotional detachment and difficulty forming reciprocal relationships in later life. As a teenager, Brady spent some time in prison and young offenders facilities for crimes such as burglary. From a young age, Brady expressed a need for intellectual superiority and control. He was a highly intelligent individual. He was very introverted and deeply inward-looking, preferring books and ideas over emotional connection. As he matured, this intellectual isolation developed into arrogance. He began to view himself fundamentally different and superior to other people. Brady became drawn to philosophy, particularly the extreme interpretations of Nietzsche, a German philosopher. Brady used these philosophical notions to justify his worldview of dominance and elitism. Rather than Brady using these ideas as just abstract thoughts, he used these notions as a way to justify dominance, cruelty, and humiliating other people. Some psychologists state that when ideology is used in this manner, to override empathy, it can act as a permission structure for violence. Equally as important is Brady's apparent emotional flatness. He showed little remorse and empathy and appeared to be stimulated by control rather than connection. These traits are commonly associated with psychopathy, particularly the interpersonal features, the grandiosity, the lack of empathy, and the emotional detachment. In Brady's case, these traits were entwined with sadistic fantasies, a desire not to just dominate, but to witness and to orchestrate suffering of other people. By the time Brady met Myra Hindley, all of these traits were already established. He didn't develop these views whilst in the relationship, he brought them with him. The relationship would just serve as a vehicle through which his need for power, control, dominance could be acted upon and reinforced. Myra Hindley was born the 23rd of July 1942 in an environment marked by emotional instability, fear, and rigid authority. Her early home life was shaped by a volatile atmosphere in which anger and intimidation were quite common, particularly by her father. As a child, Hindley learned that safety and approval were conditional, earned through obedience rather than emotional security. Growing up in a fear-based household can have a significant impact on emotional development. In these environments, children often become hyper-aware of authority figures and are highly motivated to avoid disapproval. Over time, this can lead to a pattern of approval-seeking behaviour, where self-worth becomes more dependent on external validation rather than internal stability. Hindley also experienced social isolation in her formative years. She struggled to form strong peer relationships and reported saying that she felt different or excluded. which further heightened her desire to be accepted by those that she deemed powerful or dominant. This combination of fear and the insecurity contributed to a fragile sense of identity. By her adolescence and early adulthood, these patterns had become well ingrained. Hindley wasn't unintelligent or passive, she was emotionally vulnerable, and she was susceptible to relationships that offered structure, certainty, and validation. When Hindley later met Brady, this psychological foundation played a critical role. His dominance, his arrogance, even the confidence mirrored the authority that Hindley learned to fear in her early life. She encountered someone who offered certainty, structure, qualities that she lacked internally. Over time, her personality began to shift. Her appearance changed, her language mirrored Brady's, and her moral boundaries slowly began to erode. These early influences help us understand why Hindley was vulnerable to coercion and manipulation, but it doesn't remove her responsibility. It provides an insight to how fear, identity instability, and the need for approval shaped the choices she would make in later life. This whole process aligns with what psychologists would term coercive control, a pattern whereby one individual gradually dominates the other through emotional manipulation, conditioning, and isolation. Again, this does not remove responsibility. Hindley was an adult and she made these choices, but these choices occurred within quite a narrowing psychological framework. The relationship between Brady and Hindley wasn't one of an equal psychological footing. While the pair can sometimes be described through a lens of a folie à deux, this framework doesn't fully capture the dynamics at play here. Unlike some cases where two individuals come together already sharing the same beliefs, Brady and Hindley did not come together as ideological equals. When Hindley met Brady, she was emotionally insecure, searching for her identity, and highly motivated by approval. Brady initially dismissed her advances, a rejection that would seem to only motivate Hindley more and enhanced her determination to gain his attention and approval. Brady entered the relationship with an established worldview rooted in dominance, control, and sadistic fantasies. Hindley, in contrast, became increasingly willing to reshape herself to meet Brady's expectations. Again, this is what psychologists call coercive control. Hindley's desire to be accepted by Brady made her susceptible to this form of influence. Over time, her pursuit of Brady's approval escalated. She participated in his fantasies and eventually in violence, and this became a means of securing her place in a relationship with Brady. This didn't occur through a shared delusion, but through a progression of the erosion of Hindley's moral boundaries. Hindley's commitment to the relationship outweighed empathy, fear, and restraint. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were responsible for the deaths of 5 children in Greater Manchester, England. Each child was targeted through manipulation and an abuse of trust. Each loss represented not only a life taken, but the families permanently altered by these acts of violence. Several of the victims were buried on Saddleworth Moor, a remote and desolate landscape that would later become permanently associated with the case. The first known victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed. She was killed in 1963. This was followed by 12-year-old John Kilbride, who was killed later that same year. In 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett disappeared after being approached by Hindley. His body has never been recovered. Later that year, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey was killed, a case that would later reveal the extent to which control, humiliation, and psychological domination played a central part in the couple's crimes. The final known victim was Edward Evans. He was murdered in 1965. This act would ultimately lead to the arrest of Ian Brady. From a psychological perspective, the selection of victims reflects a desire for power, vulnerability, and absolute control. Children were not chosen randomly, but because they could be manipulated, they trusted authority figures and were less able to resist. For Brady, this reinforced his sadistic need for dominance. For Hindley, participation in this only deepened her psychological commitment and increasing her identity with the shared fantasy. These crimes were not impulsive acts of violence. They followed a pattern of planning, role division, and rehearsal. Over time, this violence became normalised within their relationship and their shared psychological space, transforming cruelty into routine and solidifying the dynamic that bound them together. The murders involved a combination of restraint, violence, and concealment. The consistency of the method allowed investigators to identify patterns linking the crimes together. The repetition suggests rehearsal and reinforcement, and this behaviour became increasingly normal within the relationship. For Brady, this reinforced domination and power. For Hindley, participation further collapsed her moral boundaries and deepened her psychological commitment to Brady. Following the arrest, Brady and Hindley responded very differently. Brady maintained intellectual detachment and control, while Hindley later tried to reframe her role, expressing remorse and distancing herself psychologically from Brady. Now, this divergence is important. It reflects the difference between their ideological commitments and need for survival. Hindley's later behaviour suggests cognitive dissonance. This is an attempt to reconcile your actions with a reconstructed sense of self. The media often reduce this case into archetypes: Brady as pure evil, and Hindley as either a complete monster or a manipulated victim. These simplifications obscure the psychological reality that human behaviour exists on a spectrum shaped by personality, environment, and relational dynamics. Cases such as this provoke discomfort because they challenge the idea that evil can be obvious, isolated, or easily identifiable. The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley is not just about crime. It's about how ideology, power, and emotional dependency can converge to produce extreme violence. Understanding these dynamics does not excuse what occurred, but without understanding them, we risk making the same mistakes, assuming that monsters are born rather than recognising how they are formed.